Shomayim, Shomayim,
Good evening. How's everybody doing? Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house? Middle of the week. It was Wednesday, Yom Revi'i, but it's the nighttime, so it's already Thursday, Yom Hamishi. And Paul in the great Northwest, Shandora in the Bronx, John in Maine, Bill in mid-Missouri, Ryan in Jacksonville, Florida, Sharon in New Jersey, Karen in Northern California, Joseph got home just in time in Lowell, Massachusetts, Melissa in Great Neck, also Marjorie in Virginia, Aoife in Florida, Meggie in Belleville, Ohio, Chaim in Florida, Frank in San Pedro. Welcome, everybody. Also, Jonathan in Southern California, Nancy in North Carolina. Great to have you all in the house. Tonight's episode of AT Daily sponsored by Sherry and Jeffrey Hirsch in honor of our hostages in Gaza. May they soon be free. And we say amen, all of them. And may we achieve a just and secure and lasting peace in the Holy Land. Sherry and Jeffrey, may you and all your loved ones be showered in blessings. Thank you for enabling us to share more Torah with more people around the world. We say amen. We are going to pick this up at the very bottom of page 28a, but our daf today is actually page 29, so we're just getting a bit of a running start, shall we say. But we're going to be picking it up with Mishna number 2 here in chapter 3 of Tractate Bava, Kamma, the 21st volume of the Talmud. Generally speaking, the laws of monetary damages. And as we laid out in the first Mishnah of this Masechta, of this volume, the primary categories are the ox, and that could be by goring, eating, or trampling. And then there's pit, fire, and a person's direct force hurting another. So this Mishnah number 2 in chapter 3, very short Mishnah. If one's jug broke in the public domain and another person slipped in the water from the jug and was injured from the fall, or he was injured by the shards of the broken jug, so then the owner of the jug is liable. Rabbi Yehuda says in a case where the owner of the jug acted with intent, he is liable. And in a case where he acted without intent, he is exempt, right? So Rabbi Yehuda a little bit easier on the owner of the jug who left broken shards in the public domain, but the majority who overruled him said, hey, if you leave broken shards, this would apply to broken glass, in the public domain and liquid that you spilled, and somebody gets hurt because of that, you are liable for the damage to that person. Here comes the Gemara. Rav Yehuda says that Rav says they taught that the owner of the jug is liable only when the clothes of the one who slipped were soiled by the dirty water. But if the person himself was injured, the owner of the jug is exempt, as it is the ground that caused his injury, not the jug or the water. So Rav Yehuda brings this teaching down in the name of Rav. Is this going to survive our analysis? Sneak preview. No, it's not. Rav Yehuda continued, when I stated this ruling of Rav before Shmuel, he said to me, after all, we derive the cases of damage caused by leaving one's stone, one's knife, or one's load in the public domain from the case of one's pit. And I therefore read, i.e. apply with regard to all of them, the inference of the sages from the verse, Exodus 21:33, and an ox or a donkey fall therein, right? So if you dug a pit in the public domain, you left a hazard there, and then somebody's animal falls into that pit, okay, so you're going to be liable for the injury or death of that animal. The Torah says that expressly. Right, that the one who dug the pit is liable only if what incurred damage is an ox, but not a person or a donkey, and not vessels. Super limited view of what the Torah said. Only if an ox falls into your pit are you going to be liable, but if other animals fall in or if people's vessels break, now that you left this gaping hole in the public domain, is that what we're holding? Let's keep reading. And this statement applies with regard to a situation where the person is killed, i.e., if one fell into a pit and was killed, the person who dug it is exempt from paying restitution. Why? Because he's going to be liable for causing a death. So he doesn't have to pay restitution for damages, but he's either going to be considered a murderer or a manslaughterer, right? And we've seen before that if you're going to be convicted of murder or you have to flee to a city of refuge because of manslaughter, only one penalty is going to apply, right? It's either going to be that penalty or you're going to be liable to pay damages. Interesting that you don't have both in a rabbinic court. So here, where a person was killed, the one who dug the pit is exempt from paying restitution since the verse refers exclusively to an animal that was killed. But with regard to damage, the digger of the pit is liable to pay restitution for injury to a person, but exempt from paying restitution for damage to vessels, for which no distinction between death and injury can be applied. Therefore, the ruling in the case of the jug that broke in the public domain should be the opposite. The owner of the jug is liable to pay restitution for injury caused to another, as Shmuel holds. And in monetary issues, usually in disputes between Rav and Shmuel, the halacha, the law, follows Shmuel. Shmuel holds that he is liable, even if the injury is caused by the impact with the ground, but that he is exempt from paying restitution for the damage done to the clothes of the one who slipped. Now, this is closer to where the law ends up. Now, the Gemara asks, well, how would Rav answer this difficulty? And the Gemara answers, this presumption that liability for damage caused by one's stone or his knife or his load that he left in the public domain is derived from the category of pit, thereby exempting him from payment for damage to vessels. And this applies only in a case where he renounced ownership of them. But in a case where he did not renounce ownership of them, it is considered to be like any other case where his property causes damage. Therefore, he is liable to pay not only for injury to a person or an animal, but even for damage to vessels, right? So if you dig a pit and you leave that pit there, you're definitely liable for injury or death to an animal, injury to a person, but not to vessels, if vessels break, which is interesting. However, if you leave your stone, your load, or your knife lying in the public domain, so if you threw it away, you abandoned it, you left it ownerless, so then it seems to be going to have the same outcome as a pit. But if you left it there and, just slipped out of your bag, but you didn't mean to renounce ownership of your object, so it's still your property, and it causes damage not only to a person, but to vessels, right, to items, things, objects, you're going to be liable for that damage as well because it was your property that damaged the property of another. Now, Rav Oshaya raises an objection from a Baraisa discussing the pit. It is derived from the verse, and if a man shall open a pit, or if a man shall dig a pit and not cover it, and an ox or a donkey fall therein, Exodus 21:33. Then the digger is liable to pay restitution only if what incurred damage is an ox, but not a person, or a donkey, but not vessels. Now, from here, the sages stated that if an ox with its equipment fell into a pit, and the ox was wounded and the equipment broke, or if a donkey with its equipment fell in, and the donkey was wounded and the equipment tore, then the one who dug the pit is liable to pay restitution for any injury sustained by the animal, but exempt from paying restitution for the damaged equipment. To what case is this similar? It is similar to the case of his stone or his knife or his load that he left in the public domain, and they caused damage. Therefore, you should only be liable for the injury to the animal or the person, but not for the damage to the vessels of the person whose stuff was broken or torn in the public domain. So the Gemara questions the wording of this Baraisa. On the contrary, it should have stated, what is similar to this? Since the cases of one's stone, knife, or load are not mentioned in the Torah, but are derived from the case of pit. So rather, the wording should be amended to read like this. What is similar to this? It is the case of his stone or his knife or his load that he left in the public domain and they caused damage. And the Baraisa continues, therefore, if one dropped his flask on a stone that was left in the public domain, breaking the flask, the owner of the stone is liable. So the first clause of this Baraisa is difficult, according to the opinion of Rav, since it compares the cases of a stone, a knife, and a load to the case of a pit, and it does not distinguish between a situation in which the owner renounced ownership of them or one where he did not. And the last clause of the Baraisa, which deems the owner of a stone in the public domain liable to pay restitution for the damage to the broken flask, is difficult according to the opinion of Shmuel, since according to him, the owner should be liable only for causing injury and not for damaging vessels. So the Gemara responds to this objection. And according to your reasoning, the Baraisa itself should pose a difficulty for you. Forget Rav and Shmuel. The Baraisa itself is self-contradictory, since the first clause states that one is exempt from liability for damage to vessels, and the last clause says that he is liable. So rather, Rav resolves the contradiction according to his line of reasoning, and Shmuel resolves the contradiction according to his own line of reasoning. Rav resolves it according to his line of reasoning like this. In what case is this statement said? Concerning what case does the Baraisa rule that a stone, a knife, or a load that somebody left in the public domain are analogous to the pit, exempting their owner from liability for breakage to vessels caused by them? When is this similar? It is where the owner renounced ownership of them. But if he did not renounce ownership of them, he is liable to any damage that he causes, not only to people or animals, but also vessels. Therefore, if one dropped his flask on a stone that belongs to another person in the public domain that was not abandoned and declared ownerless, then the owner of the stone is liable to pay for the damage to the flask. And Shmuel resolves the contradiction according to his own line of reasoning. Now that you said that the cases of one's stone, one's knife, and one's load are similar to one's pit, then according to Rabbi Yehuda, who deems one liable to pay for damage caused to vessels by falling into a pit that he dug, one is therefore liable in a case where someone dropped his flask on a stone belonging to him and the flask broke. Now, Rabbi Lazar says they taught that the owner of the stone is liable only in a case where the pedestrian stumbled on the stone and the flask scraped against the stone and broke, right? So the stone that this person left in the public domain directly caused both the injury and the damage to the vessel. But if he stumbled on the ground, not the stone, and the flask consequently fell and scraped against the stone, causing it to break, then the owner of the stone is exempt from liability for the damage, right? So you left a stone in the public thoroughfare, which shouldn't have been there. The first case was somebody trips over the stone and his flask breaks against that stone. Okay, you're liable for the injury and the breakage. Now somebody trips on the ground, right? And he would have just fallen on the ground, but there was also a stone there in the path of his fall. And now the stone causes damage to the flask. So the stone didn't cause the stumble, but it was the object that collided with the person's flask after he stumbled. So now they're saying that the owner of the stone is exempt from damage. Are we sure? Let's see. Now, in accordance with whose opinion is this statement? It is not in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Nassan, who maintains that if damage is caused by two people, and one of them is exempt from paying compensation, then the other must pay the entire amount. Similarly, here, since there is no liability for damage caused by stumbling on the ground, right? You just trip over your own feet, no one's going to pay you for that. Compensation should be collected from the owner of the stone. You can't collect the one who was walking in the thoroughfare and just fell, that's his own fault. He's not going to collect from anyone for that, but his flask was broken by the stone that shouldn't have been there. So the owner of the stone, we could say, is half responsible for this accident, but he's going to be fully liable for the flask breaking because no one else is present, or no one else is on the hook to pay anything. There are those who say an alternative version of this discourse. Rabbi Elazar says, do not say that it is only in a case where the pedestrian stumbled on the stone and the flask scraped against the stone, causing the flask to break, that he is deemed liable, but that if he stumbled on the ground and the flask scraped against the stone, causing the flask to break, he is exempt. Rather, even if the pedestrian stumbled on the ground and the flask scraped against the stone, causing the flask to break, he is liable. In accordance with whose opinion is this statement? It is in accordance with Rabbi Nassim. Now, the Mishnah states that if someone's jug broke in the public domain and one slipped in the water from the jug, right? We're back to our Mishnah number 2 here in chapter 3. And the one who slipped in the water that was left from the broken jug was injured from the fall, or if he was injured by the shards of the broken jug, right? Either he slipped and fell because somebody dropped the jug of water and left a puddle of water, so the next pedestrian slips and falls in the water, or he cuts his feet on the shards of the vessel that were left there. Either way, the owner of the broken jug of water is liable. That's what our Mishnah says. So the Gemara asks, what are the circumstances in which it is considered that he acted with intent, right? Because the Mishnah went on and Rabbi Yehuda said, yes, the owner of the jug is liable if he acted with intent, but not if he didn't. So what's intent? That he just purposely threw his jug on the ground, but if it fell off his shoulder by accident, then he's not liable? That's what the Mishnah is, what the Gemara is asking. So Rabbah says, even where he just intends to lower the jug off his shoulder, but he accidentally breaks it, he is liable to pay for the damage he causes, according to Rabbi Yehuda. So what Rabbi Yehuda means by intent, according to Rabbah, is pretty far-reaching. He intended to lower his jug, right? It wasn't that he was just walking with a jug tied to his backpack and this string broke and it fell. He was actually lowering the jug. He certainly didn't mean to break it, but it was his action that ultimately resulted in the broken jug. So even though he didn't intend to break it, he did intend to lower it, and this is considered he's liable, even according to Rabbi Yehuda. The majority would certainly hold him liable for leaving that broken jug there, no matter how it came to be broken. Abaye said to Rabbah, by inference, does Rabbi Meir, who is the anonymous first Tana of our Mishnah, right? So Rabbi Yehuda would only hold him liable in case of intent. So who was the first rabbi who was speaking in our Mishnah? That's Rabbi Meir. Usually when there's an anonymous Mishnah, it is Rabbi Meir. So by inference, does Rabbi Meir, who is the anonymous first Tana of our Mishnah, deem him liable even if the jug cracked by itself? And Rabbah said to him, yeah, indeed, Rabbi Meir would deem him liable even if he were holding the handle of the jug in his hand, the optimal manner of holding such a jug, and the handle snapped, causing the jug to fall and break, an accident that is clearly beyond his control. Rabbi Meir would say, well, you should have had a stronger jug. You should have cleaned up after yourself. Too bad. It's your jug. Somebody else was hurt. You're liable. So the Gemara asks, why? Why is this so? Isn't he the victim of circumstances beyond his control? If he wasn't doing anything wrong, he wasn't acting negligently, he was holding the jug properly, and it just happened to break. Freak occurrence. And let's say that it's not that he hesitated or delayed cleaning it up. It's that as soon as it broke, somebody who was walking by got hurt right then and there. Okay, now you can say, well, this is really bad luck. I mean, he wasn't doing anything wrong. He wasn't being negligent. So why does Rabbi Meir hold him liable? Why is this so? Isn't he the victim of circumstances beyond his control? And the merciful one exempts a victim of circumstances beyond his control from punishment. right? If you really did nothing wrong, you were just, the victim of an accident or of somebody else's wrongdoing, but you didn't do anything wrong, why are you suddenly going to become liable? And where do we learn that out from? Very interesting example. We learn this with regard to a betrothed young woman who is raped. Deuteronomy 22:26. But to the young woman, you shall do nothing. She was raped. We believe her. You're not going to hold her responsible that she's no longer a virgin when she was raped. She didn't commit adultery. She's not going to get any kind of a penalty. This is completely beyond her control, and she's utterly blameless. And if you would say that this matter applies only with regard to the exemption from the death penalty, because if she in any way participated in that, it would be adultery since she was betrothed. But with regard to damages, one is liable even for circumstances beyond his control. If you would say that, but isn't it taught in a baraisa, if one's jug broke and he did not remove its shards, or if his camel fell and the camel did not, and he did not stand up his camel, Rabbi Meir deems him liable to pay for any damage they cause. And the rabbis, meaning the majority who overrule Rabbi Meir, say that he is exempt according to human laws, but liable according to the laws of heaven. Right? So Rabbi Meir himself says, Rabbi Meir is consistent. He says, look, if your vessel breaks and you don't clean it up, for sure you're going to be liable for that. If your camel sits down in the public thoroughfare, creates a hazard, and you don't get him out of there, you're liable, right? The rabbis say, no, this was beyond his control. He didn't want the thing to break. Okay, he hasn't cleaned it up yet. He didn't want his camel to sit down. Okay, he hasn't stood it up yet. Because he hasn't stood it up yet, because he could do something about it, heaven will probably exact some kind of accountability from him, but an earthly court does not. So it seems like, according to the majority, if the initial occurrence happened due to circumstances beyond your control, the person should not be liable, according to the majority opinion. Now we're on page 29a. The Gemara comments, and the rabbis concede to the opinion of Rabbi Meir in the cases of one's stone, one's knife, or one's load, that if he placed them on top of his roof and they fell as a result of being blown off by a typical wind, i.e. one of ordinary force, and they caused damage, that he is liable. In other words, if you left stuff on your roof and you didn't tie it down in the normal manner that we would expect from people, and then a typical wind came and blew that stuff off your roof and people were hurt below, you're liable. And the majority concede that to Rabbi Meir. And Rabbi Meir concedes to the opinion of the rabbis in the case of one who puts pitchers on the roof in order to dry them, and they fell as a result of being blown off by an atypical wind, i.e. one of unusual force, and they caused damage, that he is exempt, right? In other words, he took the proper precautions. The pitchers were secured on the roof in the normal way, but a hurricane came. Okay, nobody expected the hurricane. That's what blew the stuff off the roof. Okay, people got hurt below, but the guy took the proper precautions as far as everyone is concerned in terms of normal winds. And then it was this, freak occurrence wind. People got hurt. It's not that guy's fault. Even Rabbi Meir, who's more prone to hold people liable if their property caused damage to others, even Rabbi Meir would concede in that case. So, accordingly, Abaye rejects Rabba's explanation of Rabbi Yehuda's statement that he deems the owner of the jug liable even if he merely attempted to take it off his shoulder and it broke, and offers a different explanation. Rather, Abaye said that Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda disagree, right, in our Mishna, disagree with regard to two different situations. They disagree with regard to a situation where the damage was caused at the time of the person's fall, and they disagree with regard to a situation where the damage was caused after the person's fall. What does that mean? They disagree in a situation where the damage was caused at the time of the person's fall with regard to whether or not the one who stumbles, thereby causing his jug to break, is considered negligent. One sage, Rabbi Meir, holds that one who stumbles is considered negligent, as his carelessness caused him to stumble. Therefore, he is liable to pay for damage caused by the shards of his jug, which broke as a result of his stumbling. And the other sage, Rabbi Yehuda, holds that one who stumbles is not considered negligent. They disagree in a situation where the damage was caused after the person's fall, with regard to one who renounces ownership of the hazardous property. Presumably, the owner of the jug has no interest in keeping the shards, and it is considered as though he renounced ownership of them. So one sage, Rabbi Meir, holds that one who renounces ownership of his hazardous property is liable to pay restitution for damage caused by it, despite the fact that it no longer belongs to him, because he created the hazard in the public domain. And the other sage, Rabbi Yehuda, holds that he is exempt from paying restitution as it does not belong to him anymore. And if it is in the category of pit, from which we're deriving these laws, then there's only liability for injury, but not for damage to vessels, right? And this shards that one renounces ownership are likened to a pit. And from where is this interpretation derived? It is derived from the fact that the Mishna teaches two possible cases of damage, stating another person slipped in the water or was injured by the shards, two different cases. So this case, slipping in the water, is seemingly identical to that case, injured by the shards. Rather, is it not necessary to explain that this is what the Mishnah is saying? Another person slipped in the water at the time of the person's fall or was injured by the shards after the person's fall. So the Gemara infers, and since the dispute in the Mishnah is with regard to two situations, the dispute in the Baraisa between Rabbi Meir and the rabbis must also relate to two situations, as there too, two cases are mentioned. A case where one's jug broke and a case where one's camel fell. So apparently the dispute is with regard to damage caused both at the time of the fall and after the fall. Rabbi Meir holds that one who stumbles and breaks his jug, causing damage to others, is considered negligent, and that one who renounces ownership of his hazardous property is liable. And the rabbis disagree with regard to both issues. So the Gemara asks, granted, with regard to the case where one's jug broke, you find these circumstances either at the time of the fall or after the fall. But with regard to the case where his camel fell, granted, you find this circumstance after the fall, when he renounces his ownership of the carcass, not considering it worth keeping. The camel fell because it died. But how can you find these circumstances at the time of the fall? How can the camel's falling be considered to be due to the owner's negligence, possibly rendering him liable to pay for injuries caused by it? Okay, you're walking your camel through the public thoroughfare and it drops dead. What did you do wrong? And Rav Acha said, well, for example, in a case where the camel crossed through water, through the inundation of a river that overflowed its banks, and it stumbled there, so the owner was negligent, as he should not have gone by that path. And the Gemara asks, what are the circumstances? If there was another route, and he nevertheless chose this one, he is clearly negligent, according to all opinions. And if there was no other route, he is a victim of circumstances beyond his control, and he's exempt from liability according to all opinions. So what was the negligent choice that he made only according to some opinions? Rather, you find the circumstance in a case where the owner stumbled and the camel then stumbled on him. So in this case, the sages engage in a dispute whether or not the one who stumbles is considered negligent, right? So you fell. Rabbi Meir says you should watch where you're going. If you fall, it's your fault. Rabbi Yehuda says if you fall, you know, that's what humans do. Sometimes we stumble. And then if somebody, because you fell, then somebody trips over you, well, you are not negligent. So the one who trips over you, you know, that's just bad luck. Circumstances beyond your control and his. Now the Gemara asks, according to Abaye's explanation that the dispute between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda is with regard to a situation where the owner of the jug renounces ownership of his hazardous property after it falls, what is the meaning of Rabbi Yehuda's statement that if the owner of the jug acted with intent, he is liable? What intention is there after the jug fell and broke? And Rav Yosef said it is a situation where he intends to acquire the shards of the broken jug, and he does not renounce his ownership of them. It is specifically in that case that Rabbi Yehuda holds him liable to pay for damage caused by the shards. And similarly, Rav Ashi said it is a situation where he intends to acquire the shards. In other words, when his jug falls and breaks in the public domain, he's not abandoning it. He's not declaring it ownerless. He's saying, well, the shards will be useful to me. Pottery shards are useful in a garden when you're planting plants. And so he's intending to take them home. But before he does, somebody falls and gets hurt on those shards. So it's still his property. And that's why there's going to be liability for damage not only to a person, but even to vessels. Rabbi Elazar says the dispute in the Brisa is with regard to a situation where the damage occurred at the time of the person's fall. And the Gemara asks, but after the fall, according to this statement, what is the law? Does everyone agree that the owner of the jug is exempt from liability? But isn't there Rabbi Meir who deems him liable since he did not remove the shards? So rather, what is the law? Does everyone agree that he is liable? But aren't there the rabbis who deem him exempt? And so the Gemara answers, rather, what is the explanation of the phrase, at the time of the person's fall? It means even at the time of the person's fall. And it teaches us that the dispute is referring to a situation where the damage occurred after the fall, and also to a situation where it occurred at the time of the fall, in accordance with Abaye's explanation of the Mishnah. Now we're on 29b. And Rabbi Yochanan says the dispute is with regard the dispute is with regard to a situation where the damage occurred after the fall. So the Gemara asks, but at the time of the person's fall, according to this statement, what is the law? Does everyone agree that the owner of the jug is exempt from liability? But from the fact that Rabbi Yochanan says later on page 31a, with regard to another Mishnah in this chapter, do not say that the Mishnah is the opinion of Rabbi Meir, who says that one who stumbles is considered negligent. By inference, it is clear that he holds that Rabbi Meir deems one who stumbles liable to pay damages. Evidently, it is not unanimously agreed upon that he is exempt. Rather, what is the law in this case? Does he say that everyone agrees that he is liable? But from the fact that Rabbi Yochanan says later, do not say that the Mishnah is the opinion of Rabbi Meir, who says that one who stumbles is considered negligent, by inference, it is clear that he holds that the rabbis deem him exempt, right? Different than Rabbi Meir. So the Gemara answers, rather, this is what Rabbi Yochanan teaches us, that the circumstances in which the rabbis deem one who renounces ownership of his hazardous property exempt is only the situation stated here, i.e., he stumbled, as he is the victim of circumstances beyond his control. But in the general case of one who renounces ownership of his hazardous property, they deem him liable to pay for damage caused by it, right? So for sure, what it seems all agree is that if you decide that the public street is a place to dump your garbage, and then somebody gets hurt on that garbage, you put it there intentionally, for sure you're liable. It's your property, you put it there. Even though you've now declared it ownerless, you're going to be liable not only for injury to people and animals, but also damage to vessels. But if the reason that your shards of pottery are in the public domain is because you fell, you stumbled, something happened to you that was beyond your control, due to circumstances beyond your control, that seems to be where we have the dispute between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda, or even between Rabbi Meir and the rabbis, where Rabbi Meir says, well, if you fell, that's your fault, you were negligent. And the others say, if you fell, that's beyond your control. So unless you intend to keep the shards after you fell, you're going to be exempt. Now, it was stated with regard to one who renounces ownership of his hazardous property that he left in the public domain, that there is a dispute between Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Elazar. One said he is liable, and one said that he is exempt. As you can see, this dispute is getting recapitulated, not only among the Tanaim, but among the Amoraim. So, the Gemara suggests, shall we say that one who deems him liable holds in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Meir, and the one who deems him exempt holds in accordance with the opinion of the rabbis? In other words, is this the same dispute that the earlier sages had? And the Gemara responds, no, they have a different issue between them. In accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Meir, everyone agrees that one who renounces ownership of his hazardous property in the public domain is liable. Rather, when they disagree, it is in accordance with the opinion of the rabbis. They disagree as to what the opinion of the rabbis is. The one who deems him exempt holds that his opinion is in accordance with the opinion of the rabbis. And the one who deems him liable could have said to you, I maintain that what I say is correct, even according to the opinion of the rabbis. They both agree with the rabbis, but they have different results. How does this happen? The rabbis deem one who renounces ownership over his hazardous property in the public domain exempt only in the situation here because he is a victim of circumstances beyond his control. But in a general case of one who renounces ownership of his hazardous property, they deem him liable, right? If you just dump your garbage in that public domain, you're liable, according to all opinions. So the Gemara suggests it may be concluded that Rabbi Elazar is the one who said that this person is liable. As Rabbi Elazar says in the name of Rabbi Yishmael, there are two entities that are not in a person's legal possession, and nevertheless, the verse rendered them as though they were in his possession with regard to certain legal responsibilities. Even though you don't own it, you're still liable for any damage that it causes in two situations. And what are they? A pit that he dug in the public domain, right? You might have dug that pit. It wasn't your property. You dug it in the public domain. How could it be your hole? You dug it, but it's not your hole because you don't own the property that it's in. You're liable for it. You're responsible for it because you dug it, right? So even though it's not yours legally, you are liable for the damage that it causes. And what's the other example? Chametz. Anybody who has leavened bread remaining in his possession on the eve of Passover from 6 hours, meaning noon and onward, right? After noon, on the afternoon before Pesach, before Passover, you declare that anything that's in your possession is ownerless, that it's not yours. But if it turns out that you do have chametz in your possession, okay, so you are liable for transgression because you weren't careful enough to actually get it out of your possession. Although deriving any benefit from leavened bread during Passover is prohibited, and it's prohibited from noon onward on the eve of Passover, and it is therefore no longer in its owner's legal possession, nevertheless, he is also commanded to destroy it. And the Gemara concludes, it may be concluded that Rabbi Elazar is the one who says that he is liable. Meaning, even though you declared your shards that you left in the public domain ownerless, you're still liable for them, much like somebody who dug a pit or somebody who still has chametz in his possession as Passover comes on. The Gemara asks, and did Rabbi Elazar actually say this, that one who renounces ownership of his hazardous objects is liable? But didn't Rabbi Elazar say the opposite, as we learned in a Mishna on page 30? Tomorrow's page. In the case of one who turns over dung in the public domain and another person incurred damage because of it, he is liable to pay for his damage. And Rabbi Elazar says they taught this ruling only in a case where the one who turned over the dung intended to acquire it. But in a case where he did not intend to acquire it, he is exempt. So apparently, according to Rabbi Elazar, one who renounces ownership of his hazardous property is exempt, since he is liable only if he intends to take possession of the dung, even if he moved it significantly. So you're walking down the street and there's horse poop in your way. It's not your horse poop. You don't want to walk in it. So you kick it, okay. Or let's say, you're carrying a rake because you happen to be carrying a rake. And there's horse poop in your path. So instead of jumping over it, you kind of go like this with the rake and, move a bunch of the dung out of your way. But when you moved it, it goes flying into somebody's nice new white suit and makes a big dung stain on his suit. Wasn't your dung, but you moved it. Are you liable for that? Rabbi Elazar seems to be saying, if you were intending to keep the dung, then it's your dung, and so then you're liable. But if you were just moving it out of your own way and it happened to hit somebody, you're not. That's what it seems like Rabbi Elazar is saying. Let's see. Rav Ada bar Ahava said, Rabbi Elazar was referring to a case where he returned the dung to its prior place. Therefore, he is exempt unless he intended to acquire it. Not he threw it in somebody's way and hurt them with it. Ravina said, this can be explained by means of a parable. To what is the statement of Rav Ada bar Ahava comparable? To one who finds an uncovered pit in the public domain, and he covers it, and then he uncovers it again. Since he left the pit as he found it, he is exempt from paying damages, and the liability lies with the one who dug the pit. Right? Interesting. The one who dug the pit covered it so it wouldn't be a hazard. Somebody else comes along. The one who dug the pit left it open. That was the hazard. Somebody comes along and says, wow, this is a hazard. This is crazy. So he covers it. Okay, now it's safe. But then he says, you know what? This thing that I used to cover it, I actually need it. It's building materials for my house. So he takes it with him, then he leaves. Now somebody falls in the pit. Is it the fault of the guy who covered it and then uncovered it? But he left it the way he found it. No, it's the fault of the guy who dug the pit. Marzutra, the son of Rav Mari, said to Ravina, is this comparable? There, in the case of the pit, the result of the initial act of digging the pit was not removed, since even when he covered the pit itself still existed. But here, the result of the initial act was removed, since once the dung was moved from its prior place, there was no longer any hazardous object there. Therefore, by returning it to its place, the hazard is created anew. So rather, it is comparable only to one who finds an uncovered pit and fills it with dirt, and then he digs it up again. As in this case, the result of the initial act was removed, and the new pit therefore exists in his possession, and he is liable, right? He filled in the original pit, then he dug it again. Okay, well, he's the one who created a pit that's now in the public domain. So, likewise, one who moves dung in the public domain and then restores it to its prior place is deemed liable whether or not he intends to acquire it. Now, Rav Ashi said that Rabbi Elazar was referring to a case when he turned it over at a height of less than 3 handbreadths, which is not considered removal of the dung from its place. So the Gemara asks, but according to this explanation, what forced Rabbi Elazar to interpret the Mishna as referring specifically to the unique case where he turned over the dung at a height of less than 3 handbreadths? And consequently, the reason he is liable is that he intended to acquire it. But if he does not intend to acquire it, he is not liable. Why do we have to interpret it according to that complex set of circumstances? Let him instead interpret the Mishnah as referring to a case where the person turned over the dung at a height above 3 handbreadths, in which case, even if he did not intend to acquire it, he is liable. Rava said, what forced Rabbi Elazar was that the Mishnah was difficult for him. Why does it state specifically that he turned over the dung? Let it teach that he lifted the dung. Rather, learn from the fact that the Mishnah does not use the term lifted, which generally is referencing the act of lifting an object 3 handbreadths for the purpose of acquiring it, that whenever the term turned over is used, it is referring to an act in which the object is lifted to a height of less than 3 handbreadths from the ground. Meaning you handled it, you moved it, but you did not evidence a desire to acquire this ownerless property for yourself. That's why it's not talking about lifting. So the Gemara concludes, and from the fact that Rabbi Elazar was evidently the one who said that one who renounces ownership of his hazardous object in the public domain is still liable to pay for any damage it causes, Rabbi Yochanan is clearly the one who said he is exempt. So the Gemara asks, and did Rabbi Yochanan actually say this? That if one renounces ownership of his object, he's exempt from liability for any damage that it causes? But didn't we learn in a Mishnah on page 30, tomorrow's page, with regard to one who conceals a thorn or a piece of glass, or who puts up a fence of thorns, or who puts up a fence that subsequently fell into the public domain, and another person incurred damage due to any of these, that person is liable to pay for that person's damage. And Rabbi Yochanan says, with regard to one who puts up a fence of thorns, They taught that he is liable only in a case where he projects the thorns out into the public domain, but in a case where he restricts them to his own property, he is exempt. And the Gemara infers, in a case where he restricts them, what is the reason that he is exempt? Is it not because it is considered a pit on his own property? By inference, the liability in the category of pit, according to Rabbi Yochanan, is in the public domain, where a pit generally does not belong to the one who dug it. Apparently, Rabbi Yochanan holds that one who renounces ownership of his hazardous property is liable. So the Gemara answers no. Actually, I could say to you that in principle, one who renounces ownership of his hazardous property is exempt. Nevertheless, one who puts up a fence of thorns is liable, because he does not renounce ownership of the thorns that protrude into the public domain. And in a case where he restricts the thorns to his own property, what is the reason that he is exempt? The reason is not that he is not liable to pay for the damage of a pit on his own property, but rather because it was stated about this case that Rav Acha, the son of Rav Ika, said he is exempt because it is not the typical manner of people to rub against walls, but to keep a small distance from them. Therefore, if a pedestrian is injured by the thorns, it is considered an unusual accident for which the owner of the fence is not liable because it wasn't foreseeable. So the Gemara asks, and did Rabbi Yochanan actually say that one who renounces ownership of his hazardous objects is exempt? But didn't Rabbi Yochanan say that in general the law is in accordance with an unattributed Mishna? And we learned in an unattributed Mishna on page 50b of this tractate, in the case of one who digs a pit in the public domain and an ox or a donkey fell into it and died, he is liable. The Mishnah is referring to one who digs a pit in the public domain, where it is not owned by the one who dug it, and yet the Mishnah deems him liable. I'm almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in. So the Gemara concludes, rather, Rabbi Yochanan is actually the one who said that one who renounces ownership of his hazardous objects is liable. And the Gemara asks, and from the fact that Rabbi Yochanan said that he is liable, is it evident that Rabbi Elazar said that he is exempt? But doesn't Rabbi Elazar say in the name of Rabbi Yishmael that one is liable to pay for damage caused by a pit that he dug in the public domain, even if it is not his personal property? And the Gemara answers, this is not difficult. This ruling that he is exempt is his own opinion, whereas that ruling that he is liable is the opinion of his teacher, Rabbi Yishmael, and he disagrees with it. That's the conclusion of our discussion of Mishnah number 2 here in chapter 3 of Tractate Bava Kamma. We're now on page 30a, and God willing, tomorrow, Thursday, at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific, we'll open Mishnah number 3. I think open and conclude, actually, because that's a short Mishnah and Gemara. Okay, some questions on Bava Kamma 29. Jonathan, I am thinking that all the examples of a stone in the road are not examples that came up in front of the rabbis. Where did the stone come from? Who would leave a stone? Though now I'm remembering a construction site that had a bunch of bricks out front, marked with yellow tape. So again, if we have anything in the public domain that is not normally there, we should protect the pedestrian who is looking at his cell phone instead of the sidewalk in front of them. I mean, you brought up a whole bunch of issues, right, that are really interesting. If somebody's walking around with his face in a cell phone, do we really have a responsibility to protect him from tripping? I mean, he's being an idiot. He's got no situational awareness. I'm not mincing words here with purpose, because I tell my kids this all the time. You cannot be walking down the street with your face in a phone. Just don't do it. If you must look at your phone when you're on the street, stop, look around, make sure it's a okay time, and then do that. But walking around unaware of your surroundings, especially at a time such as this, really bad idea. But at any rate, a person who's being like that, now are we, is it somebody who left a stone and this guy trips over it where a normal person who wasn't looking at his phone, wouldn't? Hard to say. We have here in LA sidewalks that are routinely terrible. Because of these ficus trees that have tremendous roots and really upend whole sidewalks, so that it's not like you're walking down the sidewalk and you get, a situation like that. I mean, we will have like roots push a sidewalk to have a gap like this or bigger, right? And it happens all the time that people don't expect, such an interruption in a sidewalk and do fall, and it's not because they got their face in a phone. And then the city gets a lawsuit, and I don't know how easy it is to win those lawsuits. Probably not very easy at all. So I would certainly say, as a moral matter, that, if I'm walking down the street and something falls out of my bag and it's inconvenient for me to pick it up, but it's going to leave a tripping hazard for others, I think you need to pick that up. And I think that at least some of the opinions, if not all, would say that you are liable for that, right? If something falls off your truck, right? There was this terrible, terrible story of the famous director, Alan Pakula, right? I think that was his name. He was driving on Long Island on the Long Island Expressway. I think that's where it happened. And there was a plumber's truck, and a pipe fell off the truck. Like the truck went over a bump, a pipe fell off, bounced on the roadway, bounced up, went through the windshield of the director and killed him. That's definitely a negligence. I would say that a pipe could fall off the plumber's truck. Now, let's say it wasn't so direct that right at that moment that it fell off, an injury was caused, but he realized that something fell off his truck, more on a country road. He's got to go back and pick it up. I mean, absolutely we have to, clean up after ourselves. But I think what we're seeing over and over again is that it's hard to word general principles that are always going to make sense, because there's so many different situations that come up where the equity of the matter, right, where the fairness of the matter won't be so obvious, and that's what the sages are challenged with, and why even the same sage seems to have contradictory rulings arising from different cases, because the facts and circumstances are always different. Sharon, what if the jug broke to faulty workmanship on the part of the maker of the jug? Is the jug maker at all party to the injury? Great, so manufacturer's liability. They don't seem to be discussing that yet. Right now we're talking about, whether somebody... I mean, it's an interesting question, right? If the jug broke because of the manufacturing defect, and the one who was holding it when it broke, even I think Rabbi Meir would concede that we can't blame him if it broke and then he didn't clean up after himself and then the damage happened. Then I think Rabbi Meir would be quick to say he is liable. But, they didn't have such big injuries because, a wagon pulled by a donkey suddenly accelerated through the garage door, or suddenly caught fire, the way we were hearing cases these days of cars that spontaneously combust or accelerate. But I think that there will be more discussion of that later. Right now we're talking about simpler cases, and even these simple cases are leading to quite a bit of controversy. Now Sharon says, the therapist is coming out from me now. There are falls and there are falls. If you are drunk or careless, that is one thing. But if you have a seizure or a stroke or pathological leg fracture, obviously not the same kind of stumbling and falling. Do the rabbis make that distinction? I would say yes, I'm sure that they do. Right? We haven't derived every case yet. We're just still trying to, get our principles in place. Jonathan, okay, now I must admit my mind went to the allegory of teshuvah, making atonement. If our actions are our property, then through teshuvah, we say these deeds no longer belong to me. They are ownerless. Then, if a true deep teshuvah, we are not liable. Okay, so what Jonathan is alluding to is this general idea that the sages say that when a Jew sins, right, it's not because he's an evil person, it's because a spirit of folly came over him, right? And what he's trying to do when he's making a true and deep and considered and heartfelt and worked through teshuvah, atonement, right, is that he's saying, what was I thinking? What was I doing? That's not me. That's not me. I'm not going to be that person again. When this situation comes up again in the future, I won't act that way because that wasn't me who committed that sin in the past. It's not that he's excusing himself. It's that he's coming to understand himself and doing some deep work that's going to enable him to avoid making that behavior later. But we're definitely talking on an allegorical level here, so maybe we should just stick to the brass tacks in the public road, as it were. That's what I've got for us tonight, and with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow night, Thursday, at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific. Have a great night.